Although it would have perhaps been more appropriate to speak of Neptune tonight, the weather and the general confusion and traffic snarls that I witnessed on the way over here seemed to be a little bit more conducive to that than Jupiter. Nevertheless, we have to speak of Jupiter tonight. And it is not entirely inappropriate because traditionally Jupiter has been connected with the sign of Pisces, and I think enough is said. The title of the lecture today has the keywords from extravagance to wisdom. And as usual, I will begin with an explanation of just what I mean by those words, and then we'll move out from there and see where we are taken. Extravagance is, I'm tempted to say, the great religion of our culture. Our businesses, our careers, our efforts in life tend to be somewhat conditioned toward extravagance. We're told that the more we buy, the greater we are. We're told that the invention of something that no one needs but everyone might want is really a tremendous accomplishment. And we're, in general, given this feeling that we are not living unless we're consuming. So therefore, the more we can consume, the more alive we are. And of course, all of our lovely television shows, like the lives of the rich and famous and such, really stoke that fire and get us really out there buying things and wishing we could and that sort of thing. Now, over and against that, I've put the word wisdom, which is one of those lovely words that everyone has their own conception of, much like God. In this particular case, I'd like to suggest some synonyms for wisdom. And in this case, they would be simplicity, they would be aspiration, they would be a sense of what truly has value and what does not have value. Therefore, a kind of discrimination. But a discrimination that is very much connected to this idea of aspiration. Now, Jupiter rules Sagittarius, and Sagittarius is perhaps the most aspiring of signs in some sense. And the image of the half-man, half-horse creature with his bow and arrow firing up toward the moon or the sun, whichever you like, is an image that is good to keep in mind in the idea of aspiration. If we consider the animal part as being the as yet untransmuted energies, the bad habits, the negative aspects of ourselves, and the human part as being the rational, that which we've become conscious of, then we've got this aiming for something still higher, for the light in the heavens, for, if you like, spiritual consciousness. And this is the kind of movement that we're talking about. The interesting thing about the image is that in terms of the keywords, extravagance to wisdom, extravagance represents a kind of burden that holds back the archer from reaching his or her goal. In other words, the hunter who is busy shooting meat or busy hunting for furs isn't going to have a lot of time to be aiming arrows at the sun. And the amount of energy that we spend on cultivating our extravagances is energy wasted when we look at it in terms of the actual spiritual aspirations of our lives. So we need to begin to develop a sense of discrimination about what really has importance to us. When we're dealing with objects of luxury, and as a matter of fact, there's so many these days that many of them now seem as essentials to us, we're dealing with a kind of compounded problem. Because not only do we have a sense of identity from these objects, because we're raised to feel that somehow, in owning them, we justify ourselves, we prove something about ourselves, we display our quality to others according to just how good these objects are and how many we have. But in addition, they have a kind of practical function that we can become addicted to. They can be fun to use. They can be comforting. They can have all these kinds of very immediate, almost escapist qualities that we can become very much enamored of. So we have to begin to look in our lives in terms of not what is providing us with satisfaction, because in fact, although some of these luxury items provide us with a lot of irritation, they also provide us with satisfaction, with convenience. We have to look, though, into the time investment that goes into them, paying for them, using them. We have to look into the thought investment, the emotional investment that goes into them, and then ask ourselves whether they are truly valuable or not. There's a lovely old saying, and it exists in all the various traditions, and we are perhaps most familiar with it in the Christian, and that is, you can't take it with you. Everything that we acquire here, we leave behind us. Now, there are several ways to approach that situation. It's actually what we're facing there is that great wall, that great shadow of death, and the great question of what lies beyond it. Now, some may feel that the best way to approach it is to live the best life we can down here. This was the great Epicurean idea of early Greece. But the interesting thing about the Epicureans was that they did not live the kind of life you might imagine. They did not live in great luxurious mansions and run amok with all sorts of licentious behavior and great feasts and orgies. They didn't do that at all, because they quickly discovered that those kind of pleasures had more pain in them than pleasure. So they stopped being involved with those kinds of activities and instead lived lives of tremendous moderation. They were philosophers. They refused, for instance, to enter into arguments about such issues as whether the world was a good or bad place, where we would go when we would die, all that sort of thing. They simply lived a very Buddhistic kind of life, very simplified, in which they attempted to cultivate the pleasures that they felt were most profound, and those were really spiritual pleasures. So we have a lesson then, even from those Greek philosophers who set out to live a life of pleasure. There was no kind of morality behind that, just simple, what's the best kind of pleasure? And they arrived at what we would recognize as an aesthetic, very spiritual form of lifestyle. So, we have again this wall, this death. What do? Do we respond with a kind of fatality and say, well, I'm here now, and as long as I'm here, I'm going to make it as cushy as I can. I'm going to have a good time, and I'm going to surround myself with the things I need to feel real comfortable. So the day when I go, I can at least say, but I've lived quite a life. It's a possibility. Another possibility, one that's less popular in our culture, but one that perhaps all of you here are flirting with, whether you're aware of it or not, is to die before you die. And this is, of course, what all the great initiatory experiences are. This is what it means to become enlightened, at least to the greatest degree. It is to rise out of the limitations of the body and to have a clear perception of the eternity in which the soul exists. It's another approach. Interestingly enough, as I've hinted in talking about the Epicureans, both approaches wind up in the same place. If you wish to gain enlightenment, in other words, if you want to get a peek at where you're going, then you have to live the kind of lifestyle that allows you to build those perceptions. The Tibetans, who are great experts in what they call bardo world, the after-death states, they've spent hundreds of years in studying them, report to us very detailed records of what the after-death experience is like. And they tell us that there is a very recognizable 6 or 7 element sequence that I really won't bother you with now. It's simple enough to find in Tibetan books. It has to do with perception, beginning with a kind of smoky blue haze and ending with a kind of clear light of bliss, as they call it, great clarity of consciousness. They say that this process happens to us every time we fall asleep. It happens in reverse every time we wake up. It happens when we begin a dream, and in reverse when we end a dream. It happens in any form of ecstasy, no matter how physical, that we experience. But we don't notice it. The question then is, why don't we notice it? The explanation is that our senses are so coarsened by what we habitually pay attention to that we miss the really subtle things. In other words, we're so busy wrestling with our microwaves and with exploring different kinds of food that we can cook in them, and we're so busy absorbing the tremendous amounts of core stimuli that our culture offers us, whether they be narcotic, alcohol, television, food, whatever they happen to be. We've got this tremendous variety that enables us to do a wonderful job of stunning ourselves, almost unconscious. And in so doing, we miss a great deal. So we have these greater senses, and our problem is, how do we open them? In other words, how do we clarify the sensory passages? And here again we run into this question of extravagance versus wisdom. Because the more we go for that idea of extravagance, the more we go for the physical possessions, the more we're coarsening our senses. It's through sacrifice, that incredibly ugly word for some people and beautiful for others, that we actually develop these greater perspectives. There's a tradition that in the metaphysical way of living, you must give something up of your own free will before you can be given something. And what you're given is always greater than what you give up. You run into individuals like Mahatma Gandhi, who made sacrifice a kind of avocation. They sort of gleefully ran around figuring out what they could get rid of now so that they could experience a new kind of energy flow. And Gandhi, as an example, often said that his efforts toward service were in some sense very selfish, because he loved so much the feeling of helping others. He loved so much the energy that was unleashed when he was actually one-pointedly concentrating on helping other people. And it was out of love of that he continually sacrificed things in his life to get more of that energy, to be able to serve more and more, to find new vistas of service opening. Now, this is actually the fact. We need to look into our own lives and find examples of when we have aided others unselfishly and what the result has been. Sometimes we can spend years working on projects that we feel are intended to better others, and we don't get a lot of satisfaction from them. In fact, we get a lot of frustration. That project is very often another person. We have found some form of spiritual path that speaks to us, and we feel that if we can just share it with this other person who's having troubles, then they will suddenly discover the light and everything will be just fine. And at first, there's a kind of afterglow as we first give them the information, and a friend once described this process in a way that I can't do better to, so I'll repeat it. And that is that you rush in with all the right books, and you tell them about all the wonderful changes it's done for them. And then, 6 months later, you walk into their house, and they've got all the wrong books. They've gone completely in the other direction, and they have become egomaniacal. And all you were trying to do was show them that if they went the other way, they would have wonderful experiences. All these problems would resolve. Instead, they've aggravated all the problems. Now, depending on just how stubborn you are, you might give it up right there and decide, well, it's for wiser minds than mine to deal with. Or you might get back in there again and get into a good argument about, no, don't you see these books and that sort of thing. And your project, the other person, can be a source of absolute frustration for you, and perhaps as well as should be. What's necessary, then, is to realize that the moments when we really feel the rightness in our hearts are spontaneous moments. These are moments when we're in the street, walking, and we see someone who is hungry. And we have a kind of hunch about it. They don't ask us, but we walk up and say, have you had a meal today? And they say, oh, yes, yeah, I've had a meal. And we instantly recognize that they have not. And in some unobtrusive fashion, we arrange that this person have a meal. We hand them over a few dollars, or we actually go into the restaurant they're standing outside and order a meal for them and have it brought out. We find some way, then, spontaneously, according to the need of the moment, to aid this person. We overcome our natural fear of doing that. Most of us have a sense when we wind up in that kind of situation of, no, I just know if I walk up and say something like that, they're going to start yelling at me and cause a whole scene, and the police will be there, and it'll just be terribly embarrassing. But we have to overcome that and feel that, no, the need, the feeling that something has to be done here has fallen into my path. I'm the one who has to do something about it. Now, when we do that, and it can be something as simple as a friend who calls up and says, I'm in real deep financial hot water here, and we've been saving up all kinds of money for a trip or something like that, something special, and they need just about half that money, thereby destroying the trip. How do we respond? If we respond with, here is a legitimate request from the world, let alone from a friend, for money that I have been given as a trustee, not as an owner, we then realize that we have to make a decision about what the best use of that money is. We are trustees. Should the money then be spent in aiding this person to get out of their troubles, or should it be spent on our trip? In some cases, it might be that the money should be spent on the trip, because there may be some compelling reason why that trip must be made. But you see, the responsibility falls on us. And the decision will, in a sense, advise us whether we were right or wrong. When we have chosen, we will have a sense either of freedom, a sense of warmth from the act, or we will have a sense of guilt or a sense of contraction. And at that point, we'll have a pretty good idea of whether or not we were good trustees. So, returning then, for a moment, still illustrating, to this picture of our project, the person that we're working on, we have to have some realizations. And that is that the spiritual path can be an extravagance also. It's very easy to point out fancy automobiles and microwaves and all sorts of lovely kitchen gadgets and say, now these things are not really necessary. These are merely extravagances. But it can sometimes be very hard to point at spiritual doctrines, to point at truths that we find very deep in our hearts and say, this also is an extravagance. Now, how do we tell that it's an extravagance? Comes a time when the books, the doctrines, whatever it might be, that moved us very deeply cease to do so. They become leaden. And it's very difficult for us to become sensitive to that sudden change. And it can be quite sudden. It can sometimes be something as subtle as a shift from a feeling of, boy, I can't wait to get into this stuff, to, I really should get into this stuff. I've had it here for a long time. If it is books, they're a good example because they're so nice in material. It's when they start to sit on the shelves like 16-ton weights. And every time we open them up, all they do is confuse us. And yet we know that this is the same book that meant so much to us earlier. Well, this is an extravagance. This is a possession. We have turned a spiritual doctrine that was a source of life for us into an object that we now own, a kind of display piece. And very often, when we are dealing with others in this kind of project relationship, and we're trying to help them, uplift them, we do so with this kind of use of extravagances. Most of us are familiar with the overused television plot of the parent who tries to buy the child's love with money, buys gifts and all this stuff, but never actually talks to the child, never really listens to them. Well, this is very similar to what we can do when we're in this project relationship with somebody. We're not listening. We're not spontaneous. We're not responding to the demand of the moment. We have these objects, these books and these doctrines that meant something to us, and we push them on the other person, never thinking that perhaps the doctrine, the book, is not right for that person. As a brief illustration, in Buddhism we have two schools called the lesser and the greater vehicle. The lesser vehicle is known as Hinayana Buddhism, and the goal of Hinayana Buddhism is to produce what's called an Arhat. An Arhat is an individual who has achieved enlightenment, who will not need to be reborn again, who will simply, in a sense, enter into a whole new realm of being after death. The Arhat is not terrifically concerned about how the world is doing. The Arhat is not worried about sentient beings reaching enlightenment. Now, about 100 to 300 years later, arose another school in China, Tibet, eventually in Japan, called the Mahayana school, the greater vehicle. Now, interestingly enough, they chose the name greater vehicle, which may alert you to something right away. And they had a different idea. They wanted to produce a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva was an individual who was completely dedicated to the good of others. They illustrate a bodhisattva as having 1,000 arms and a hand in every arm, that was good, an eye in every hand. The idea being that those 1,000 hands represent the ability to aid people, skillful means, to be able to do the right thing at the right moment, no matter what the situation is. And the eyes represent the ability to see all the suffering in the world and to see how best that suffering can be dealt with. In general, in the West, the Mahayana school has been far more celebrated, and in fact, all over the world, it has become the dominant force in Buddhism. The idea seems to be that the Arhat is selfish, that the Buddhist who goes up into the caves and just sits there and meditates his way into nirvana is a very selfish human being, and therefore there's something wrong with that path. But there's a fundamental thing that's being missed in that judgment, and that is that the Arhat has a perception of life that differs a shade from that of the Bodhisattva, and that is that the Arhat might be said to have a greater faith in the world. Because the Arhat's argument is basically this: I arrived at enlightenment by my own labors. Nature, karma, suffering led me to it. And I cannot lead others to it. They must live their own lives. They must have their own suffering, their own karma, their own experiences. And that will take them to enlightenment. It may be later, it may be sooner than mine, but I can have nothing to do with that. Now, at best, the Mahayana Bodhisattva is, in a sense, a combination. There's a bit of the Arhat in him. In other words, the goal is that the Bodhisattva is not going out there saving people. The Bodhisattva is a vessel of natural force. In other words, if he or she is in the right place at the right time, they do the right thing, and they become part of nature's plan in redeeming others. And so you could reduce the whole picture down to one thing, and that is that the Bodhisattva feels that he or she should be in the world, just as a presence, as an example to other people, because they might have the opportunity for an act of kindness that changes a person's life. They never take any credit for it. It's simply that in the nature of things, in the divine mind, it was time for that to happen, and they were there to do it. The Arhat, on the other hand, is perhaps a bit more stringent about his belief and feels that it won't make any difference if he's in the world or not. There might even be a touch of a rather acidic wit, feeling that the more they suffer, the more quickly they'll become enlightened. So why should I be there and muck things up? Both of these ideals deserve our consideration when we begin to approach helping other people. The reason that I'm focusing on this idea of helping other people is because all of you, if you have not already contacted this, will soon be contacting it, and that is a responsibility that all those on the path of inner knowledge have. And that responsibility is that you must aid others. In other words, you have to share what you have learned. Now, this may seem to contradict the Arhat ideal, and yet in a sense it doesn't. Because if you consider the fact that the Arhat is living in a Buddhist community until a certain change of consciousness occurs, and then simply leaves the community. If you consider the rippling effect of that example, what happens to the other monks in the community when they suddenly realize that this monk who's been laboring at enlightenment for years and years has achieved it and has now left the monastery, has gone out to simply live in nirvana, in a sense, alone, you can see that even in that case there is a teaching going on. That the Arhat has actually made an interesting statement. The Arhat has said, from this point, I can no longer teach. The only thing that I can do to teach is to leave. Because in that act of leaving, I have symbolized for you what my enlightenment has been. I have left this world. I have nothing more to say. So there is teaching in that act also. Now, most of us are not in the position where we're about to go off and live in the Himalayas for the rest of our lives because we've achieved nirvana. We're in the position of living in the community of those laboring for enlightenment. And this means that we need to share what we have understood. When we don't share it, we get a kind of interesting clogged pipe effect. It seems that all of a sudden, inspiration stops flowing. All of a sudden, we're not feeling right, feeling adjusted with the universe anymore. All of a sudden, we feel a little bit like we're floating along in a flood and we just don't know where we're going anymore. It used to be a river, but now it's just a kind of turmoil. That's usually because we have something to give and we're not giving. We've been taking in. We haven't turned around and given to others what we have understood. Now, the interesting thing is that there is not a soul who doesn't have something to teach. The beauty of all this is that the wisest among us, in a certain way, is perhaps the most ignorant in another way. And therefore, we can all teach each other something. Whatever the skill might be, however apparently humble, it is nevertheless a responsibility of ours to share that skill with those who the world puts in our path. And if we're very sensitive, we'll note something. In a past lecture, I discussed how friends, and particularly enemies, but both, are reflections of ourselves. That if we look at them, in other words, if we take a complete mosaic of all of our friends and of all the people we feel hostility toward, we'll get a pretty good picture of ourselves, and the parts of ourselves that need work, and the parts that don't, and the irritations that our friends cause us are problems that we have within ourselves. But there's another quality in these friendships, in these relations, and that quality is teaching, sharing knowledge. Each of our friends, each of our acquaintances, each of the people that we simply meet has something to offer us, and we have something to offer them. We simply need to be alert to what that might be. Now, being alert to it means that we are open to it. It does not mean that we leap into the situation with our mind ablaze and look for just the thing that this person needs because we're liable to give them exactly what they don't need in that situation. It means that we really listen. We let them talk. Now, there's an amazing thing that happens when we apply that philosophy. First of all, we really hear for a change. You'd be surprised how often we have a tendency to hear exactly what we're expecting to. And language is such a mucky thing anyway that it's easily twisted into what we want to hear. And the resulting misunderstandings can be fairly awesome. So what we need to do then is to listen past the words, to listen to the gestures, to the voice. And beyond that, to listen to the situation, the context in which we are meeting the person. Because there will be many keys in that context also. There will have been things that happened to us in the last few days or even weeks that relate to this meeting with this person. Tiny little harmonics in time. There will be these kind of harmonics after we meet them also. They're all little clues to what the secret, the key is to this situation. Also, in the very room that we're sitting, or in the very place that we happen to meet that person, there will be all kinds of little hints. It's just like interpreting a dream. We have to sit back and ask ourselves, now, what can I learn from this meeting? In doing that, it's very surprising what sorts of understandings develop, how we hear very clearly what the person is saying. An amazing thing is that, in general, when you feel that you are covering up your feelings, in other words, when there's something you really want to unburden, but you just can't bring yourself to do it, and so you talk around it for half an hour, It's shocking how much you actually say. If the person you're speaking to is really listening, you've given it all away very quickly. And so that's what we have to do. We have to learn to really listen to these people that we're attempting to help, to transform them from projects into living spiritual beings, realizing that their potential is infinitely grand. That in fact, although we may be the great Messiah at this point, that a little bit down the line, there may be a little shift in the relationship, and that in fact, they may teach us a great deal, perhaps even on a path different than our own. It sometimes amuses me to discover that in speaking with a person who has tremendous spiritual interests and who is obviously well-balanced, you will often never talk about spiritual matters. You will either share jokes, or you will listen to them discuss how they took a carburetor apart, or something like this. In general, the more enlightened the individual, the less they're going to trust words to get across their point. And if you're real alert, you might notice that all that talk about the carburetor has a very special meaning to what you're attempting to understand right now in your life. In other words, it's put into the form of a parable. And parables are one of the most wonderful forms of teaching because, first of all, they have many levels of meaning. Secondly, you can't really hurt yourself with them. If it's a good parable, it's usually so simple, so common, so mundane, that there's not a lot of damage you can do to yourself. On the other hand, if you are faced with a 50-page manuscript of metaphysical instructions and ritual, boy, can you do a lot of damage to yourself. Now, beyond that, the parable is also teaching you a very important gift. It's teaching you to be really attentive, and it's teaching you how to interpret things. And those are two skills that we all will find extremely helpful on this path of life. In any occasion, when we can walk into a situation and really be listening, really have our senses wide awake to what's happening, and when we're also interpreting, even as we see. And this is this kind of flash interpretation, not an intellectual one. It's a kind of sudden agreement of elements, when we suddenly see, oh, I see how all this fits together, and this is the message of it. Those kinds of experiences are tremendous aids, not only in our own development, but in aiding others in theirs. I tell you, I should be lecturing on Neptune today. So let's pull back for a moment then and come back down to the extravagance level. Talk about that for a few moments. One of the interesting historical facts, when we look back into the wide expanse of what's happened in the thousands of years that we've been recording our exploits, is we discover, first of all, that most of the other races, most of the non-white races, in other words, the non-Western, had a way of living with tremendous rapport in nature. In general, they took what they needed to take. They didn't hurt what they didn't need to hurt. In general, they were able to stay in the same place for thousands of years without poisoning it, without damaging it in any serious way, leaving it from generation to generation in as pristine a state as it ever was. And then something very interesting happened. The white was unleashed on the world. And if you think about it for a moment, if you look into your history, you will get the impression that the white race has destroyed everything it could get its hands on. It was up to us to learn how to make, for instance, poisonous gases and atomic bombs, and we really were inventive. We got all kinds of wonderful things. And the amazing thing about it is that we were often contradicting ourselves in the effort. We sort of took the art of fortifications to its utmost degree and came up with these wonderfully complex sardine-like cities which were supposed to protect all of us. And then we invented bombs and made the cities completely useless. In other words, we've really been out here causing a stir-up. Now, if you're an optimist, and I hope you all are, after all, we're here talking about Jupiter, you will realize that there was a reason for that, and that all that stirring up was very necessary. And along with it came some very important realizations, some very important discoveries, some very important changes in human consciousness. But something interesting has happened with the invention of the atomic bomb and of world mass communications. We've sort of run out of things to destroy. We pretty much realize that now we can destroy ourselves and the world, and that's about it. There's really nothing left to wipe out. We're doing our best. We're poisoning water and developing acid rain and that sort of thing. But even that is beginning to bounce back on us. And we're realizing that we're going to have to change our ways a little bit. Now, interestingly enough, for the first time in our history, masses of us have started to turn around and say, you know what? Maybe these so-called primitive cultures have something to tell us. I mean, we basically shoved the Native American off the continent and eradicated whole civilizations of them without even thinking that there might be something in their teachings or in their lifestyle that we could learn from. A few people along the way, one or two here and there, got the message. And they wrote these books furiously, trying to preserve what they could of those now long gone rituals and ways of life. But now it's become a more popular movement. Now there's interest in African folklore. There's interest in American Indian folklore. There's interest in mythology in general. We seem to be going back into this realm where things aren't so well defined in an effort to discover what we've missed. Why has the Western lifestyle become so empty? How is it, for example, that we were able to take as beautiful a teaching as that laid down by Jesus and pervert it into the violence that we did? How did that happen? Maybe we need, then, to reconsider what those words were, to go back and to contact, again, those early childhood experiences of our race, of the white race. See what kinds of things we've missed. In doing that, we discover, once again, this simplicity. Over and over again. All of the great so-called avatars, all of those human beings who have achieved a truly awake consciousness, combine in a very simple form of life. These are people who continually eschewed possessions. They continually put distance between themselves and objects in the world. Their only ambition was to simplify and to serve. And then when we look at the cultures that have been pretty much eradicated, some of them still exist, the Australian Aborigine culture, the Native American culture, the black cultures, in general, what we find is a very simple communal way of life. We find the minimum destruction of resources. We find sharing of various commodities that are needed for life. We find a very different approach than our own. What we find is a lack of extravagance, a lack of the kind of waste that we have. Now, if any of you happen to live in an apartment building, you will perhaps have noticed a very interesting phenomenon of 20th century life, and that is that a group of 150 people can live on top of each other and never really see each other. They hear each other once in a while, they get annoyed at each other once in a while, maybe once in a while they all get together to argue some problem out. But they really don't know each other. And when you consider the fact that inside every one of those apartments, there's an oven and a refrigerator and washing machines and microwaves and all that kind of stuff, but nobody ever uses anybody else's, you get an idea of the tremendous waste that we're talking about. Waste of electricity, waste of everything you can imagine, in a sense, because we don't have this communal sense. And beyond the waste, think of the terrific isolation that most modern human beings suffer. This terribly alienated sense of not fitting in anywhere, of not really having any belonging, sense of being in community. It's very difficult for us to have that kind of sense when we're so inflexible. And the reason we're inflexible is another kind of extravagance. And that extravagance is that we only want to have around us the objects that reflect who we think we are. And that includes people, unfortunately. We're not willing to adjust and say, well, you know, I'm not crazy about Leo who lives down the hallway, but he's a human being, and he's here for a reason, and there must be something I can learn from him. There's got to be some kind of relationship that will be useful that it can occur between us. Rather, we normally say, I just don't like that person. They're not my kind of people, and I'm not going to have anything to do with them, and that's all there is to it. And in doing that, we give up a very valuable opportunity for enrichment, for service, for all kinds of wonderful experiences. In general, the apartment building is one of the most bizarre of all the concoctions of our society. Because, in fact, one can live there for 10, 20, 30 years, and another person across the hall can live there for 10, 20, 30 years, and that person can die. And we will have, first of all, no idea that it's happened for perhaps weeks. We will wonder what that person was like. We will have no contact then with their life or their death, despite the fact that they may have been 10 feet away from us all that time. And that's also a kind of extravagance. What we do about it is we become wise. We open up. And we obey a very simple Sufi statement, which was, if you wish to have others help you lift your burden, friends will be few and far between. But if you wish to help others carry their burdens, you will always have friends. I'm going to ask a question, first of all, and that is, how many of you met someone you didn't know before the lecture began? You see, that means that people were listening. I'm tempted, I'm not sure I'm going to do this, but if I were a teacher, I might require all of us to stay an extra 15 minutes afterwards to meet each other, just to enforce the principles that I'm talking about, but I think that's a little bit fascist. But if anybody feels like it, I'll end a little bit early, and maybe we can do that. I also want to make a brief announcement that I probably should have made before the tape started running, but that's all right, and that is that I do counseling. I do it usually in situations of some form of urgency. I don't charge for it. I like to deal with people who really need it. And when I started to think about it, a couple persons came up and asked me whether I did or not, and so listening to my own rhetoric, I decided that that was affirmation. So anyone who you know, or if yourselves, if any of you are interested in that, the way to contact me is simply to leave a message with the Philosophical Research Society about being interested in getting some counseling and your phone number, and I will get in touch with you that day or the next day or the day after that, and we can arrange some sort of meeting. And what I mean by urgency is that I don't really like to get together to discuss philosophical issues. That's more of a social visit, and you'll have to approach me more directly if you want to do that. Instead, I'd like to talk about specific problems, whether they be real difficult depressions or career or anything that seems to be derailing a person from what they feel is their path in life. So that announcement being made, and the poor people who buy this tape and aren't here being properly alienated from what's been happening, I can continue with the lecture. We were discussing the amazing apartment house complex and the fact that here we all are living in the same place. And of course this goes for houses too, because in general neighborhoods are close enough that this same thought applies. People living near each other without any real interaction. Now, interestingly enough, there is a subtle level of interaction. This is what I'd like to discuss for a moment. We live in a very sprawled out city, and most of us do a great deal of driving. We live one place, we work somewhere else, we socialize a third place, and perhaps we have friends who live way away from all three of those. And each of those places has a feeling to it. Now, first of all, I don't think it takes a terrific imagination to realize that this is not a particularly delightful place to live. That there is a kind of presence here that is not the most pure and uplifting that one might wish. There's a great deal of fear, a great deal of frustration, a great deal of anger that we have to contend with. And there's a great deal of hopelessness that might be said to emanate from the center of the city, and ripples of it sometimes bounce around to all the rest of us. If we watch television, news, or listen to the newspaper, there's another Neptunian slip for you, or look at the newspaper, read it, we will generally aggravate that situation. We become aware of what sorts of things are happening, and our sensitivity is piqued. The result of this is that we have all forms of moods that come on us, and we don't really know where they're coming from. And sometimes we feel that there's something deeply irrational about us. And we don't often notice, because we tend to be such sleepy creatures, that in fact, it's when we go to this particular place that this mood comes on us about 5-6 hours, a day or two later. And that when we go to this other place, another mood arises. Of all the moods, of all the mood makers, let's put it that way, perhaps the worst is where we live. Now, we have a certain amount of control over our environment. Now, I want to pause for a minute here and discuss again this idea of extravagance or possessions in terms of how we decide what possessions are good, because many of us don't feel that at this point we wish to go out and hawk everything we own and buy a robe and sandals and live a Gandhian-type existence. We may not make it out here doing that. We need to choose, then, things that will make our environment as conducive as it can be to our spiritual goals. Now, some of you may have run into these wonderful old formulas that the witches and warlocks and wizards of the centuries past put together. All this stuff about mixing up this particular herb with that particular seashell and this kind of stuff. And you wonder what is actually being done there. Or then again, you may have contacted through astrology that there are certain herbs, certain colors, certain whatever, that have affiliations with a certain planet. Now, what you've got there are raw building blocks. You don't necessarily have to pay attention to the astrology or to any of that. You can decide for yourself if you like. But the point is that you can create an environment. You can choose particular objects because they stimulate you, because they inspire you. You can choose certain colors because they have a certain effect you want. One room where you do your work, you might want to have painted in a very warm, bright, inspiring color that appeals to your intellect and keeps you optimistic. In the room where you sleep, you might want a very serene, comfortable color. And this differs for individuals. And of course, if we're living with someone else, we have to find a common ground where both agree that this particular color has effects that we like. Now, the effect of paying that kind of attention to our environment is dramatic. It also has to do with our clothing. It can even have something to do with our automobile. I remember at one time I owned a wonderful car that was absolutely the worst colors I could possibly be involved with, because every time I got into it I was deeply depressed. And I was such a sleepy person that I never even thought that maybe it was because the colors were depressing me. And it's amazing that having gotten rid of that car and gotten one that has colors I like, I'm not nearly so irritated driving as I once was. And I've also discovered that those particular two colors in the old car have become colors I exclude as much as possible from my life, because they just simply always have a depressing effect on me. Now, all of us have these little pet peeves, these little colors that appeal to us and colors that don't. This is not a suggestion that we get heavy into the metaphysical aspects of colors and objects and that sort of thing. It isn't really necessary to glamorize them that way. What we're really dealing with here is simple creativity, artistry, realizing that there are certain objects, certain colors, certain things that appeal to us and certain others that don't, and therefore adjusting our environment to reflect that. Now, an interesting thing happens here, and that is that in general, that kind of affiliation with colors and things will change over time. And here it comes in very handy to be a person not attached to objects, to be a person who instead is very flexible and adaptable, so that therefore when you go out and you spend a fortune to get a particular object, because every time you look at it, it just thrills you. And one day you realize that it doesn't thrill you anymore, that on the contrary, it just sort of sits there. You've got to be willing to get rid of that object and get something else that thrills you. And if that means completely turning around the whole environment, shaking it up a couple months after you had it set, that's fine. Because the comfort or the laziness of an accustomed environment is something that none of us really need. What we need to do with our homes is to make them a kind of sanctuary, a kind of temple, if you like, a place where when we enter it, we are recharged. The things that we see speak to us. They remind us of things we might forget when we go out. Now, we generally don't have very much control over the other apartments, the other people who live right around us. In fact, the more we try to control them in general, the more trouble we have. But an interesting thing is that they, too, have their influence on us. If we live in an apartment building, we walk down the hallway, and the peculiar person who lives down the hall has their door open, and we peep inside. And that has an impression. That leaves a certain influence on us for at least a little while. And every time we pass that doorway, that same influence is refreshed in our memory somewhat. We remember having looked in there and seen that. Now, how do we deal with that? Do we move out somewhere where nobody will be able to influence us? I don't think so. I think that the way to deal with it is just what we've been talking about. It's to find out who that person is. It's to find out what the secret of that environment is, to learn from it. In general, especially with annoying things, when we only see them with peripheral vision, when they hardly make an impression, all they kind of do is just give us a feeling of discordance, that discordance can be relieved if we will simply find out more about the object. It's that simple idea that there's good in everything. And if we can discover that good, we've learned something very valuable. And even the so-called bad in it, the part that doesn't harmonize with ourselves, we can learn a lot from that too. And we may perhaps discover that that so-called bad is something that we need to become acquainted with. We need to open up that side of ourselves. We need to get ourselves to the point that we are no longer affected by what does not agree with us, that we can allow others to live the kinds of lives that they would like to live. And we can enjoy the fact that they're living those kind of lives without feeling that it threatens our own. So once again, we arrive at this idea of trusteeship, of non-ownership. The way we arrive at it is this. There are certain objects that pass through our lives. We choose them to reflect us, to inspire us, to do whatever it is we happen to want them to do, keep them around for a while, and either pass them on while we live or allow them to be passed on when we die. And other people do the same thing. The stream of objects just passes through, and everyone selects from it what it is that they most like. Now, we can sometimes have a sense that there are certain kinds of objects we would really like to be involved with, but we just don't have the money or the time or the whatever opportunity to be involved with them. It's possible for us to take pleasure in the idea that others are involved with them. Now let me explain this a little bit. There's a difference between ownership and experience. What makes something that we own enjoyable to us is our experience of it. That's really all. The idea of ownership is simply that we can experience it whenever we want. That's sort of the idea. And if we don't want to have someone else experience it, we can take it away from them. But if we're willing to relinquish this idea of ownership, realizing that it really is a misunderstanding, realizing that we really own nothing, again, that we are simply trustees, we can enjoy what other people own. In other words, if we don't have a garden, but we would really like to have one, we can enjoy gardens that our neighbors or friends have. We can go to a park and enjoy that. We can go downstairs and enjoy the narcissus blooming by the road. We can find our garden everywhere. And in a sense, the city can become a garden for us because what we focus on is no longer the buildings, but it's all the greenery and the flowers and all the grass and whatever it is that most appeals to us in that way. Now, this is an idea that is very difficult for many to understand, and part of the reason it's difficult is, I believe, not so much in human nature as in social conditioning. We discussed earlier in the lecture the fact that we're brought up in our society to believe that I consume, therefore I am, and there's ownership involved in that. And so it seems very peculiar to us to feel that, well, I don't have to own this. I mean, I can enjoy it just by seeing it, by knowing that that other person is enjoying it. That's fine. Now, this is an interesting step because, you see, there tend to be three levels
at which we associate to what we don't have. I should add, to what we don't have and we want. The first level is, boy, I've just got to get that. And we put everything we can into getting it. And if we don't get it and we realize, the little light dawns and says, likely as not, we're never going to get it. The next step, especially if we found the spiritual path, and I put that in quotes, is to say, yes, but people who have that, they're not spiritual. They all suffer. They've got terrible lives because they don't understand that true poverty is spiritual. That's the second step. And the third step is when we can let them enjoy it. And we can enjoy it too. We can say, well, that's lovely, I think that's just fine. I mean, if they're really enjoying that, that's okay. And I don't live that way, but I can allow them to live the way that they live. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're miserable. If they are miserable, well, I think that's a real shame, and if there's anything I can do about it, I will. But I certainly don't have to grind them into the dust, thinking them inferior creatures because they have what I want. What happens when we make that realization is something very magical, and that is that all of a sudden, the whole world is ours. We have a kind of joint ownership with everything, or I should say joint trusteeship. And that is the underlying fact of life. We own nothing. In general, we can't even pass on what we own to our children. It tends to get dissipated. If you work in the PRS library, for example, you would be amazed how many prized libraries that a person painfully collects over years wind up in boxes downstairs the moment that the owner passes away. Because all those people that those books were being saved for weren't interested in the least. To them, the books were so many burdens. So we really can't pass along these things. We can't keep them excluded. They are common property. And that's the truth of life. They are really intended for helping one another, for sharing. Now, an interesting thing has happened. It seems appropriate to mention the situation in Ethiopia when we're discussing extravagance and wisdom. And I'd like to begin with an illustration, and that is that recently in an article, it was pointed out by an Ethiopian who asked to remain anonymous that there was a change happening in Ethiopian society that was potentially very destructive. And it's an interesting change because it seems to be a kind of westernizing that's happening. And that is this, that villages that used to communally share their possessions in the sense that there was a single person who happened to have a donkey but let everybody else use the donkey when they needed to. There was another person or family who owned the granary and would let them use it. There was another person who owned perhaps the plow and would let those who needed it use it. There was a kind of sharing then of the things that these people had trusteeship over. This suddenly changed as a Marxist regime came in and said, no, you're all going to share this stuff. No one's going to own it. And the result was that no one took care of the animals, no one took care of the plows, everything fell apart. There was a kind of pristine communism at work in that culture before our version of it, and it is our version in the sense that it is a Western version, came in there and tried to do it right. Now, I mention this because it's a suggestion about the way we should approach our own possessions. And that is, we should look at them not only as aids to our own development, but also as potential aids to others. Everything that we own has this kind of potential. Now, for example, most of us have closets in which there are clothes that we have not worn and will not wear if we happen to live for a century. We just simply have them there, and they gather dust, and that's it. Those clothes are our possessions, we think. Actually, those clothes are something we hold as trustees. And there are many people who could use those clothes. And if we're very wise about the situation, we realize that those old clothes gathering dust back there are kind of like little depressing points of dust in our own mind. Every time we go in the closet, there they are again. And in a sense, that's the cosmos, if you like, or nature giving us a nudge, saying, why don't you get rid of these clothes? Why don't you give them to somebody who really needs them instead of having them gather dust? And eventually, perhaps we go out and we find somewhere or someone to give them to who really needs them. And all of a sudden, those useless clothes gathering dust become very useful. And we have been good trustees with that particular possession. Now, there are all sorts of things like that we have, and among them are our talents, which in a sense many of us consider to be possessions. Those are talents that we need also to share, whatever they might be. And again, I'll mention the Ethiopian crisis and point out that many people feel that either they wish they could give a great deal of money, because that would somehow make the situation better, or they simply do give a great deal of money and figure that that's the end of it. And for some it is, because for some that gift of money is all that they can give. What they're good at, and there are people who are good at nothing but it, is making money. And therefore, the obvious thing for them to do is to give money. Now, there are other people who have other skills. There are some who have been born very strong. And what they can do is they can move things. They can lift things. And they can contribute that. There are other people who can speak, who can write, who can handle accounts, whatever the talent might be. Those are the talents that we need to share with others. And the beauty of that situation is that when we begin to share them, they multiply. They really grow, they expand. And when we use them in a selfless way, they expand all the more dramatically. In other words, when we enter a situation, and we're not entering it because we want to gain livelihood from it, but we enter it because we want to help, and that's all. Even if we spend a few moments, a few hours, once a week, once every 2 weeks, that time has a tremendous effect on us. There's another lovely Sufi saying, which is that when we take 1 step toward God, God takes 7 steps toward us. That's the general idea here. That when we make one little small effort, when we recognize the fact that there are people in need and attempt to give succor to them, then we find a sudden blossoming. We find that we have even more to give than we expected. And we find that avenues of giving open up that we never imagined before. Now, of late, this problem of other people's agony, suffering, has become very apparent. We have a situation with the homeless in this city. We have constant media attention to the famine in Ethiopia. Our psyches have been hit pretty hard with the idea that the world has got some pretty ugly places in it. And there are things happening that are very painful to people, to children, to people very much like ourselves in many cases. And there's some sense of discomfort about that, certainly. It might not be guilt. It might be a simple kind of feeling that things just aren't right. Now, if you happen to be very metaphysically inclined, or if you happen to have the faith of the very strongest and purest sort, you will look at the situation and say, karma. It will never be completely alleviated because it is through suffering that we learn. And yet, if your faith is truly pure, you will realize that still the effort to aid is the all-important service, is the all-important act, is the true act of enlightenment. The effort to give, to serve, to help someone else in their suffering is the very essence of all true spiritual understanding. When we begin to feel the pain of the world, then it is that our consciousness begins to truly blossom. And there you have the key to Rosicrucianism. You have your cross, your place of crucifixion, you have your rose vine with its thorns of suffering, and you have the great red flower blossoming from them, which is very much comparable to the great 1,000-petaled lotus that represents enlightenment in the Eastern tradition. And you also have the statement from the Rosicrucians that it is only in washing our hearts in blood, in suffering, that we can begin to truly stand in an enlightened relationship to the world. So long as we are focused on ourselves, so long as we are taking in then without giving out, we are in a sense neophytes. We're attempting to purify. We're attempting to understand. We're attempting to define ourselves in some sense. And this is a useful, necessary effort. But there comes a time in that development when all of us begin to feel a little urging, a little sense of, well, there are certain things that need to be given. We feel that we need to say things to certain people. Or we see a photograph in the newspaper and our heart really aches at what we see there. And we begin to give. We begin to speak to people. We begin to do whatever it is we can do to aid them. But that isn't enough either. We suddenly discover that all the energy we had been spending on becoming enlightened shifts to how can I help people? And a magical thing has just happened. We've gotten very close to enlightenment, if not actually having been enlightened. We've shifted from me to the world. We've shifted from what can I do to develop into a Mahatma to I don't want to be a Mahatma, I just want to help people. What can I do to alleviate a little bit of suffering out there? Now this is why we sometimes run into individuals who are involved in what's called charitable work, and it's nice to remind ourselves that the original meaning of the word charity referred to the purest kind of love. It was not simply giving things that we no longer needed to people. It was that perception of unity, that a human being who suffers is me suffering. And beyond that, it's the perception that the divinity within us sees the suffering of the divinity in another person. And there must be a gesture of aid. There must be some attempt to help. The first problem that usually meets us when we make that kind of decision or we have that kind of understanding is what we're going to do. Once again, in general, our culture feels that you've got to have one of two things to be very useful to people, and that is you've got to have lots of money or you've got to have brawn and organizing power. Those are the people who really get it done. But the fact of the matter is that there are several levels at which this works. The first level is that in our lives, we are constantly meeting people who need our help. And oddly enough, when we're open to helping people, it's surprising how many are put into our path. Now, this can be when we're driving along and we see an individual standing on a corner with a sign saying, "I need to work or I will not eat today." And we may not have any work, but we may have a few dollars in our pocket. And we may offer those few dollars, explaining, "I would give you work if I could, but I can give you this." Or then again, it may be we receive a phone call in the middle of the night from a friend who's suffering. And rather than feeling like, I've got to get to work tomorrow, and I just don't have time for this, and perhaps either putting them off or listening but only halfway, because what we're really thinking while they're speaking is, how could they be so rude? How could they do this to me? I mean, really. Instead, we shake off the sleep, we don't worry about tomorrow, and we simply say, here is a person suffering, and nothing else is important at this moment. The fact that this person has been put in touch with me means that there's something that I can give to help alleviate that suffering. And so I better pay attention so I can figure out what it is that I can give. And maybe it's just listening, really listening. So there's that level, all the little things that happen to us, kind words, telling a person who has not heard it, perhaps in years, from ourselves or anyone else, that we love them, that we really care for them and we're delighted with them. We tend to forget to do that, sort of taken for granted, but people need to hear that. And that's a kind of giving also. That's a kind of charity, if you like. And then we watch for opportunities. Perhaps we make phone calls or we send letters that say, these are my skills, this is the amount of time I have to offer. Your organization appeals to me. Are you interested? If they're not, fine. We wait for another opportunity. If they are, that's fine too. Perhaps then we can apply those talents. The point is that this giving can be very comfortable. It doesn't have to be throwing away everything we have and running to Ethiopia. For some people, that's precisely what they need to do. But for other people, it needs to be a much more gradual process. It needs to be simply, first of all, paying attention to the world around us, because this place is full of pain, is full of suffering and alienation. And every single person who can provide an optimistic and loving example, who can say a few kind words, who can help someone gain a little understanding, is doing an inestimable good. Very often, we can have our whole day saved by a kind word in a supermarket. And being the person who gives that kind word is a very important kind of charity. Being alert to where that word needs to be given. Being alert to where a person needs to laugh, perhaps, and providing the joke that will make them laugh. Or, once again, being sensitive enough to see that we have a few extra dollars in our pocket, and there's a person over there whose clothing is a little bit shabby, who looks a little bit desperate. They're young. And perhaps we have a sense somewhere down deep that there's something not quite right in this picture. Maybe they're a little bit hungry. And maybe all we can do is take those few bucks in our pocket and give them to that person. Maybe we can do a little more. Maybe we can hire them to do something for us. Maybe we can give them the phone number of someone we know who is looking for someone to do some work. But it's this sensitivity. It's this meaning well for others, trying to help them, doing unto others as we would have them do unto us. What do we really want from other people but care, consideration, honesty? This is precisely what we can give to others. Now, impulse, desire, leads to thought, and thought leads to action. And it's surprising what happens when we put out that desire, when we say to ourselves, I really want to help. And for a few days, not much happens, maybe for a few months. But if we keep focused on every opportunity, if we each day try to find at least one place where we can give a little bit of aid to someone, whatever that aid might be, we do discover that new opportunities open. And very often we make a really wonderful discovery, which is that our business or career suddenly coincides with service. All of a sudden there's a way that we can turn our major effort in life toward aiding the greatest number of people that we can. If we're blessed with that, we can be truly thankful and go ahead full steam. If we're not blessed, we needn't be bitter. We can still do the most we can do. Volunteer when we have time to volunteer. If we don't have time, then in our place of business, look for those people who need a word of kindness or a really listening other person to speak to, and provide that. Now, there's all sorts of wonderful Jupiterian repercussions. You know, Jupiter is considered to be a great blessing of a planet, although those who have suffered from its extravagances might disagree. But there's an amazing thing that happens when we decide to give, when we expand of ourselves, let our heart go out to other people. And that is, we become a kind of beacon light to others. And then our experiences transmute. We have opportunities we never dreamt of. People confide in us, trust us. We are trustworthy. And we are therefore given situations in life that require a trustworthy, listening person. You see, creation, we are told by every tradition that has come down to us, is suffused with mind, with what has been called in the Greek and Christian tradition, nous, the divine thought, the word. In other words, there is an order to all of this. And everything that occurs is right. We have to have the faith to believe that what seems wrong to us seems wrong not because the divine mind has failed, but because our own minds are not sufficient to seeing the rightness in the situation. Having realized that, we can apply it to our own lives and live the realization that what we have and what we do are exactly what we deserve. We have exactly what we need at this time. If we're not satisfied with it, that is our problem and not nature's. We either have to adjust our circumstances through interchange or be ground down by them. In other words, there's a lesson we're here to learn, each of us. They may be the same lessons, they may be different. There's probably many of them for all of us. And the situations we find ourselves in are our teachers. The people we meet, the objects we contact, the challenges that we face teach us what we need to learn. If we don't like them, it's very likely because it's a painful lesson. But it's nevertheless a lesson we have to face. Believing, then, in the essential rightness of the world, we can realize a little something else, and that is that we get what we deserve in a positive sense as well as a negative sense. None of us are black creatures. None of us are parched to the core. All of us have certain kinds of goodness about us. All of us have certain kind of gifts to give. And all of us have the capacity to understand that the so-called blackness that we have is light that we don't see as yet, that our eyes are not adjusted to. In other words, it is a kind of ignorance on our own parts that sees the dichotomy of evil and good and does not find in them the wonderful image of the Chinese yin and yang, the balance of forces that is necessary in creation. Now, nature needs people who will be honest, caring, who are committed to serving others. And when these people pop up and are dedicated, they find the paths they need to find. If you wanted to go down into the very core of what made Jesus the Christ, you would, I suggest, discover that faith. That here was a person who said, I believe that all things in this world happen for the best. And that wherever I'm taken, wherever I go, whatever I do, so long as I am sincere, honest, and dedicated to service, will be as if done by God, will be divine will, and will work out to its best. And that commitment powers all the rest. And that commitment does not arise from the enlightened perception that the world is all good, because in the records that we have of Jesus, we have some very beautiful human moments when Jesus seems to be doubting, seems to be saying, boy, I'd rather not do this if I could avoid it. The famous Gethsemane scene. It's not then this enlightened perception of goodness in the world. It's just this desire to serve and to believe that sincerity and service together are unstoppable, that they take us where we need to go, and that we can't even imagine where it is they will take us. If you try to visualize the lives of the greatest examples we have in history, you will be struck by the amazing pattern of their lives, by the fact that at their 20th, 30th, maybe even for some of them 40th year, they never would have imagined where they were winding up. And I might add that we have plenty of examples of those who had those kinds of changes and discoveries very late in their lives. We have our 70-year-olds and 80-year-olds who suddenly shift. A good example is a writer I mentioned last week who is rather defamed these days, perhaps for good reasons, perhaps for not, and that is Henry Miller, one of the most acidic of all the writers our culture has produced, who in his late 70s all of a sudden had a pretty interesting turnaround that we don't hear much about. And that is, he suddenly started to write stories that had to do with after-death experiences, with the Devachan plane and other theosophical teachings. He suddenly started to quote copiously from such authors as Manly Hall and Albert Pike, and completely shifted his attention in life. And once said, interestingly enough in an interview, that it had taken him 70 years to figure it out. That all those books he had written before, all that venom, was just sort of getting the plane clear so that he could finally get an understanding of what was meant in human life. Now, he could never have imagined that while he was writing Tropic of Capricorn. When we look at the lives of a Jesus, or then again of a Ramakrishna or a Gandhi, we get the same impression. We have Gandhi in England, a very bashful, very naive Hindu, attempting to learn law and not doing a terrific job at it, we might add. It's doubtful if he would have been a lawyer if he'd been around now. Had really no idea what he was going to wind up doing, but increasingly had a greater conviction, a greater desire to serve. And that service took him all over. Took him to South Africa, took him to serving in the Red Cross during a war, and finally took him to India and the effort for Hindu independence. An effort that, it might be added, has ramifications perhaps far more important than we suspect. We might wonder why, if Gandhi was a realized soul, why be involved in a political struggle? Consider for a moment that because of the freedom of India, we, the West, has first of all learned a touch of humility. We no longer straddle the world as we once did. And secondly, all that Hindu doctrine that we pretended was mere superstition was suddenly unleashed on the world. All the Ramakrishnas, all the great teachers of the Hindu lineage suddenly became our teachers too. Or then again, you look at the life of Ramakrishna, who was considered to be a rather moronic child, and everyone thought was going to come to a bad end, and emerges as one of the greatest teachers of that century. So we don't know where the ride is going to take us. What we do know is how we are propelled. And I'm going to leave you with that point. And that is that selfishness and extravagance are the things that add weight on our journey and keep us stagnant or kind of swimming around in the same circle because we can't get enough momentum to break free from it. And when we start to drop those extravagances, when we start to care more for others than we do for ourselves, when we start to focus on giving, all of a sudden the trip begins, the journey starts. Where it takes us, we have no idea. And most of us go through this wonderful period of guessing. This is our attempt at being Hebrew prophets. We try and see exactly what's going to happen. Boy, if I do this, this is going to happen. And then it doesn't work out. A week or so later, we see a different vision of things. And finally, we realize that it's really not up to us to choose, because that's selfishness too. Choosing our life is the ultimate extravagance, having it all our way. Instead, what we need to do is simply be dedicated to giving, dedicated to doing whatever small things we can do to help others, and see where the journey ends. It will likely be a far more beautiful place than we have dreamt of when we first began. Thank you.